Demon Kissed, Chapter 23. Keeping hold of the blade, I spun into my attacker's body and slammed my elbow into their wrist, breaking it. Releasing the blade, I caught the hilt as the sword dropped from the now useless hand of my now obscenely screaming assailant, and raising the sword, backed away quickly. Now that I could see the person clearly, I looked at him over and recognized him immediately. "What the fuck are you doing here, Cade? I could have killed your dumb ass," I demanded and chastised at the same time. I was both pissed at Cade for pulling something like that and concerned about the damage I'd done to his sword arm. I glanced at the sword and swore. "Iron? You came after me with an iron blade?" I asked incredulously, and wondered if his intention had been to kill me. It wasn't an unreasonable thought. A steel blade would have done to take my head and disable me for a while. An iron blade, on the other hand, would have killed me outright. "Mother of all the gods! Shit! Fuck! Niseraid! That hurts, damn it!" he yelled, and I rolled my eyes when I noticed he wasn't even holding his wrist. "I'm too old for this kind of childish bullshit," I muttered, and threw the blade at his head and light jumped to the widow's walk on the roof. I took 2 steps forward and froze when the flat of his sword touched the side of my neck. "You were one of her favorites, you know," he said from behind me, his tone mildly amused. "One of whose favorites, Cade? If you are speaking of Lay, she had no favorites when it came to her mates," I said, and the blade withdrew as I heard him chuckle sadly. "There you would be wrong, my Seelie friend. But then you wouldn't be the first man to underestimate a Fireforge and end up with egg on your face," he said, and stepped around me on my left. "Very true, but she never truly showed a preference for one mate over the others," I said. "Be that as it may, I didn't come here to talk to you about the other mates," he said, and sheathed his sword while I watched him carefully. "Then why are you here? To try and kill me?" I asked. "I came here to talk to you about Nick's crackpot theory, not to kill you," he said, and added, "I think I might have an idea about how the reestablishing of the link was possible and how it relates to Aaron Malone." "And this brilliant idea of yours is?" I asked with mild sarcasm. "Reincarnation," he said, as if that one word explained everything, and grinned. "Fascinating. Now, if you will excuse me, I have roses to tend and laundry to do," I said, and light jumped to the backyard of the estate. Cade dropped from the roof 4 stories up and landed in front of me in a crouch, then rose fluidly to his height of 6 feet and 10 inches. I brushed past him, and he grabbed my arm, stopping me. I glared at his hand for a moment, then looked at him. "Listen, Merrick, just hear me out for a minute. I remember Lay saying something about cheating the rules of reincarnation once, and I think there's a good chance she actually might have done it," he said, releasing my arm. I stared at him for several seconds and then started to laugh. "It sounds like something she might have said when she was drunk off of her beautiful ass. But what the hell? Let me hear the rest of the reason you think reincarnation is the answer to the riddle," I said, shaking my head a bit and still chuckling. "She said something about tying a soul to a particular bloodline and making it so that the blood-bound soul would only reincarnate in that bloodline," he said seriously, and I blinked. "And this applies here how, exactly?" I asked. "Nick mentioned birthmarks last night, and it got me thinking of what Lay had said about rigging reincarnation. Then I remembered that she had been the most powerful blood mage in recorded mystical history when she was alive. Merrick, if I'm right, and she did pull off the spell, we may have a real problem on our hands where Alistair's little human is concerned," he said. "I don't really understand what you just said, but how will Aaron be a problem?" I asked. Lay mentioned adding soul markings on the body the soul reincarnates into, and making it to where they only appear at a certain age or when a certain condition is met, he said, and I blinked as a hazy memory of a similar conversation with Delia surfaced in my mind. I couldn't quite remember everything she had said, but what Cade was telling me now sounded very much like what I vaguely recalled, and I felt my skin pale a little as I got what he had meant about it relating to Aaron. "The rose vine on Aaron's throat," I murmured, and reached up to touch my throat. "Exactly," Cade said a bit grimly, and I looked at him closely. "How do you mean?" I asked, and he laughed darkly. "Aaron has no clue who she was, and I'm betting she won't take it well when she starts remembering things from before she was ever freaking born and begins to figure it out," he said, and I nodded. That could very well be a problem, especially if she remembered who she had been and freaked out on us. "Think about it, and let me know if you can think of anything else that can explain it," he said, walking toward the shadows by the wall, and called over his shoulder in a condescending tone as he stepped into them. "And, Merrick, if I'd really been after your head, you'd be dead right now." Then he was gone, and I was left alone in the yard again. I turned and made my way to the tool shed on autopilot, my mind a jumble of whirling, jangled thoughts. I shook my head when I picked up the chainsaw instead of the rose shears, pushed the jumbled thoughts to the back of my mind to think about later, and forced my mind to calm down. "If I'd really been after your head, you'd be dead right now," I mocked in a perfect imitation of Cade's voice, grabbing the rose shears off of a low shelf and a pair of gardening gloves, then continued muttering as I left the shed. Could he have possibly been any more condescending when he said that? I mean, really. I may not have trained for years to take out Dominic, but I did train hard to battle by the man's side, and I know I can still hold my own against Cade, the arrogant, unseelie prick, if I have to. I sensed a vampire very close by, but dismissed the sensation of their power as there were several high-level masters in the house at the moment, and continued walking toward the roses. "Not from what I saw, you couldn't," Lucian's deep, faintly French voice said from directly over my head, and I stopped walking for a second, then kept moving toward the rose hedges along the wall. "What do you want, Luke?" I asked conversationally. I am beginning to truly hate old vampires. One never truly can tell how close they really are until they have one nicely trapped and drained of life, I mused, bending to trim back some of the dead lower branches on the first rose bush. This was the fourth time in a week that I'd been snuck up on by one, and I began to wonder if perhaps my threat awareness was fading, or maybe I just kept ignoring the signals because I lived with several of them. "The thrill of your stunning company," he said sardonically, and I laughed at him. "You and I both know that you wouldn't even be out here at this hour of the day if you didn't want something important, Lucian. And a desire for company has never been important enough to drag you outside before 3 in the afternoon," I said, and he chuckled. "True, very true. I was in the dining room earlier and overheard your conversation with Alistair. I was wondering why you were so honest with him, if his question had bothered you so much that you left, and wanted to know why you did not press him for an answer to your question," he said. "I see," I said after a moment's thought, and stopped trimming the roses for a moment to turn and look at him before asking. "Is this just idle curiosity, or does my answer beget me another question?" "I do have some questions that I would like to ask. However, your answer has no bearing on them," he stated, and I nodded. "So, just curiosity, then. Very well." I was honest with him, because his question was straightforward, and his silence was all the answer I needed to my question. Therefore, I had no need to press him on the matter. I said, shrugging, and returned to trimming the roses. You are an odd fae, Marek. Most of your kind would have played word games with him and never really answered his question in truth, he stated, and I felt my shoulders tighten a little in irritation at his phrasing. Everyone thought all Daionshi were the same in one respect or another, but his wording pissed me off a little, and I drew in a silent breath before rising and turning to face him again. Not all fae play word games, Luke, I said mildly, then turned and moved to the next rose in line. True, but the fae that are like you are very rare and are difficult to find, he said seriously, and I shrugged as I began trimming the next bush. True enough, I suppose, and many fae would not know a complete truth if it bit them in the ass. But, Luke, I left out much when I answered Alistair's question earlier, and I left him with even more questions. I did the same just now when I answered you, I said, and he barked out a laugh. We are used to not being told everything when asking questions, Marek. We were used to it long before you came into the fold. Delia was a master of understatement, if you recall, he said, and moved into my view. I noted that he was gathering up the dead rose branches that I had let drop on the ground, and chuckled. You don't need to help me, Luke, though I do appreciate it, I said, and cut another branch. I know, my friend, but I came out to bother you with questions, and picking up a few branches is a small price to pay for your time and patience, he said, and caught the branch neatly as it fell. You have yet to truly ask me anything, I pointed out, moving to the next rose, and I noticed something odd about the lower branches as I crouched down. 3 branches were broken completely off, and 2 were bent at an odd angle, as if something or someone had crawled under the bush. Kneeling down, I studied the ground beneath it, and noticed several other details about the broken branches lying there. The thorns had blood on them, and some hair was caught in the leaves. The breaks were recent, too, and seemed to have happened either yesterday or last night. Is something amiss? Lucian asked, crouching next to me. I don't rightly know if amiss is the correct word, but it would seem an animal or some other creature has been under here recently, I said, and continued studying the ground. Something wasn't quite right here. The ground looked too soft, and the mulch had been disturbed, though I could see that some effort had been made to hide the disturbance. A wild animal wouldn't have tried to cover up the fact it had been under a bush, I thought, frowning. Setting the shears aside, I moved the branches carefully, then probed the dirt with one finger, and it moved easily. Pushing my finger down further into the ground, I discovered a hard surface about 2 inches down and started brushing the dirt away from it carefully. What is that? He asked, when I uncovered a rectangle of dark metal several minutes later, and I shrugged as I studied it. Not much longer than a good-sized book, it was about 5 inches wide and seemed to be about 2 inches high. Tugging off one of my gloves, I tried to lift it out of its hiding place, and hissed in pain when I touched it with my bare hand. Jerking my hand back, I looked at it and saw bright red blisters forming on the fingers and palm of my right hand. The hand still bore the blistered cut from Cade's sword, and I compared the forming blisters with the fading ones from the sword, then swore as the new blisters began to turn black and bleed. The damn thing was made of cold forged iron, and I couldn't touch it without getting severely burned again. Luke, can you get that out of there? I asked, backing away and standing straight again. Oui, he said, and reached under the bush with one hand to drag the thing out. Once he had it out in the sunlight, I could tell it was a small, strong box of some kind, and crouched down again to look at it closely, but I didn't touch it again. I blinked sudden sweat out of my eyes, and noted the faint gleam of something oily and wet on the hard metal surface under the dust. What is that? I wondered. Why would someone bury this under the roses? He asked, diverting my attention, and I shrugged, suddenly feeling very hot and lightheaded. I don't know, but it's made of cold iron, and I can't touch it. I said, and showed him my hand. "We need to tend your hand and bring this to Alistair," he said, and picked up the box. "You're right," I agreed, and tried to rise, but my legs had quit working and my vision suddenly blurred, running in streamers of bright light and color. "Oh, fuck," I muttered, and fell onto my side. The damn box had to have been coated with hawthorn oil, or some other fey poison like it. Rowan, maybe. "Medic, what is wrong?" Lucian barked with concern. I felt his hand gripping my left shoulder and rolling me over. I couldn't see a damn thing anymore. My heart was pounding, my breathing had become ragged, and I was beginning to lose consciousness at an alarming rate. "Hawthorn oil," I whispered, finally scenting it, and heard him swear violently. I also thought I heard Erin call my name before I completely passed out from the poison. But that couldn't be, because she was asleep, I thought, as my mind lost the fight to remain aware. I was in and out of consciousness several times, and each time I was semi-conscious. I could hear female voices talking around me, but I couldn't make any sense of their words. When I was unconscious, my rest was interrupted by broken, fevered dreams and memories that made no sense. I regained full consciousness what felt like days later and rolled over in bed weakly. Forcing my eyes open, I winced as bright light stabbed into my head and closed them again quickly. "Shit," I croaked, and then coughed violently. My eyes hadn't been this sensitive since the time I let Leigh talk me into trying her whiskey. Never again, I'd sworn. Besides, I hadn't been drinking, had I? "Easy, Kitty," a faintly Scottish female voice said, and I felt a cool hand touch my bare shoulder. Then I was being gently rolled onto my back again. "You're still burning up, pretty kitty," the woman said, as something cold and wet touched my forehead. I hissed and tried to move away from the cold, wet thing. "You need to lie still and finish letting the poison get out of your system," she continued, easily holding me in place, and I finally recognized her voice. "Easy for you to say, Ash. You're not the one suffering on a bed of hot coals," I croaked and shuddered violently as chills suddenly racked my body. "You've been out for a long while now, pretty kitty, and I've been tending to you the whole time. A little gratitude would be nice, you know," she said, her fingers touching the left side of my throat with firm pressure, and I heard her counting under her breath. "How long?" I asked, and tried to fight off another coughing fit. "About 72 hours now," she said, removing her hand, and added, "Your pulse is still just this side of not being there at all, and your hand still isn't healing right." I tried to speak, but ended up coughing instead, and she growled at me. "Just be quiet, will you? I swear all men are giant-sized pains in the rear when they're sick or hurt," Ash said in an irritated tone, then added under her breath, "Male cats are worse, though." I heard her move away from the bed and opened my eyes again. The light hitting my eyes didn't hurt my head quite so bad this time, and I looked around carefully. I had apparently been taken to a random room in the mansion, because I didn't recognize the glaringly white paint on the walls and ceiling. "Where am I, Ash?" I asked, after clearing my throat, and was rather proud of myself when I didn't cough this time. "Why don't cats ever listen?" she demanded, and returned to the side of the bed. "Because we know all," I said seriously, and then asked, "Would it kill you to use my name for once, Ashlyn?" "Sorry, pretty kitty, but I don't use the names of critters I can chase up a tree," she said, and I choked on a laugh. "But you never said that to Leigh, Pooch," I said, and she smacked my shoulders lightly in retaliation. "You'd be right, but then I never tried to chase him up a tree either. You, pretty kitty, I have chased up a tree, and I enjoyed it very much. Now rest and get better so I can do it again sometime," she said, and there was a note of fondness in her voice. "I'll rest after you tell me where I am," I said, and she sighed. Nick's place. We had to move you here because there wasn't a soul at Alistair's who knew how to fix hawthorn poisoning in a fay, and it didn't help that you had cold iron burns on your hand too. You would have died if we had left you there, Merrick, she said after a moment, and I blinked. I've been in Dominic's home for 3 days? I asked, and she nodded. And I asked another question. Who's been looking after Aaron in my absence? Lucian, I think, she said, and had to push on my shoulders to keep me from sitting up. Is he still alive? I demanded, visions of the dark-haired Frenchman being turned into Swiss cheese by little pieces of flying lead flitting through my mind, and I felt sick to my stomach at the images. He's fine. Now settle down, Mouse Breath, she said, and I blinked at the insult. Mouse Breath? I choked, and she shrugged. You are a cat, she pointed out, moving toward the door, and I glared at her back. I will have you know, Madam Bones, that I have never eaten mice in my life, and I am highly insulted you would even say such a thing to me, I said indignantly, and she gave an evil-sounding chuckle. That was the point, pretty kitty. Now that you're awake, I can let Nick know and catch some shut-eye myself, she said, and left the room. Had Ash been awake the entire time I'd been unconscious? I wondered, feeling sleep tugging at my mind and closing my eyes. I drifted off to sleep, still thinking about that, and found myself in a dream state, memory soon after. Lay, you need to stay in bed and quiet while you heal from your fall off of that mountain, I said in exasperation upon entering her bedchamber and finding her leaning heavily against the wall beside the bed. She was also clutching the green blanket that was supposed to be on the bed to her ample chest. I can't stay in this bloody gods-be-damned room a second more, she nearly yelled, then stood there, panting for breath and swaying unsteadily on her feet. Crossing to her side, I swept her up into my arms and put her back in the bed. She grabbed the long braid hanging over my shoulder and yanked on it hard when I tried to straighten again. Vicious female, I hissed, and had to catch myself on my hands to keep from falling on top of her when she yanked on my hair again hard enough to throw me off balance. Bloody stubborn male, she hissed back, then sat up and sank her fangs into my left bicep. God's damn it, Lay! I growled, and grabbed her hair to pull her head back. She surged up under me, then pushing on my shoulder, she rolled over while I was not quite steady, and landed on top of me with her legs on either side of my hips. I stared up at her in surprise and shock. Now that I have someone to sleep with, she panted, and sprawled on my chest with her head lying on my left shoulder. I stared up at the dark stone ceiling for several long minutes and tried not to move, or think too much about the fact that I had a beautiful naked woman lying on top of me and that she was straddling my hips. No, best not to think on that too much, I thought wildly, and jumped a bit when she pressed her nose into my throat, purred, and started kneading my chest with her nails. Chills erupted along my skin at the sensation, and I shivered slightly. Lay? I said hesitantly when her tongue swept over the side of my neck and she settled more comfortably on my body, which began reacting in typical fashion to the contact. She hummed in question and licked my neck again. My breathing was becoming erratic, and my pulse had begun to pound hotly through my veins. I blinked, licked my lips, and swallowed hard, trying to think of anything other than my naked vampire boss licking my neck. You should be resting, I panted, and she nipped my jaw lightly before whispering in my ear. I am resting, Merrick. Lay dug her nails into the muscles of my chest, and I groaned. You're tense, my lord. Here, let me help you, she murmured, and sat up, seating herself firmly against me. My hands shot out and gripped her hips, holding her still. For the love of the gods, Lay, do not move, I gasped, and she chuckled. Is there a problem, my lord? She asked in a falsely innocent tone, and wiggled. I hissed in pleasure and tightened my grip on her hips, tightening my grip on her as my hips rose from the bed of their own accord. "Evil bitch," I groaned when she wiggled again and I bucked against her. "Am I evil, Merrick? Or am I just giving us both something we've been dying for?" She whispered and leaned forward until her hair draped us both in a blood-red curtain, and she could look into my eyes. Her sea-green eyes were dark and smoky with lust, and I tried to think past the desire clouding my own mind. I passed the point of thought, however, when she dipped her head and kissed me deeply. I slid my hands from her hips, up her back and to her hair, and held her head still as I kissed her back. There was something important that I needed to remember, but at the moment all I could think about was her taste and how fast I could get her under me in the next few minutes. "You taste good, Lee," I growled, pulling back from the kiss a bit, and then rolled over with her. "Gods!" she gasped when I settled between her legs and nipped her neck. I pressed my nose to her soft skin and drew a deep breath of her musky scent. Becoming drunk on desire and the feel of her under my body, I slid down on the bed, nipping and licking her skin as I went. Little gasps and moans echoed around me with every touch that I gave her, and I smiled against the flesh of her breast when her fingers clenched hard on my ass, as she tried to pull my lower body closer to hers. Reaching down, I grabbed her hands in a gentle grip and pinned them above her head, then kissed the side of her neck. Her breath caught and her pulse sped up under my lips. I chuckled in delight at her response, before taking her mouth again in a deep kiss. I had heard that strong women in positions of power and who made life-or-death decisions every day were often very sensitive to being held prisoner while in the bedchamber. I had also heard, or rather been told, that women like Delia, who were charged with the lives of the men under their command, those very few military commanders that were female, that spent every day making life-and-death decisions for those under their command, always reacted one of two ways. One, she would fight you and most likely beat the ever-loving shit out of you, and two, she'd melt like honey. Mind, the person who had told me this was a very drunk Delia Fireforge herself, and just before the job that had put her in this bed to begin with, I suddenly remembered, and mentally groaned in aggravation at myself. Because Lay had melted as soon as her hands touched the pillow. I didn't want to stop what we were doing, but she was still healing from a nasty fall from a cliff, and this was not what she needed right now. Releasing her wrists reluctantly, I broke the kiss and rolled over to the other side of the bed, away from her. "Merrick, why did you stop?" she asked, and her voice was husky with arousal. Her voice wasn't just husky from arousal, I suddenly realized, as an involuntary answering growl rumbled in my chest. There was a rumble of growl underlying the words that was hard to hear under her natural accent of Scotland, but my inner cat heard it and stretched. I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed. I just sat there and hung my head for a moment, trying to get my breathing back under control. "Merrick, are you well? Ni enai fensierai?" she asked, and I chuckled as my mind automatically translated her version of an elven endearment, "my sweet kitty." Literally translated, it meant "my honeyed feline." "I am well. However, I need a moment to regain my sanity," I said, and realized immediately that I shouldn't have said it. "I see," Delia said, and her voice was flat. I didn't scent any kind of emotion from her at all, and I closed my eyes. Hells, I couldn't even smell her any more, and I knew what that meant. I had hurt her by pulling away and by saying what I had the way I had. I had only witnessed her shut herself this tightly behind her shields once, and I had wanted to kill Alistair for it, because she had disappeared for 2 weeks, and not even Dom could find her. "Lay, I want you so badly right now that I cannot think straight, and I do not want to accidentally hurt you more than you already are. But if you shut down like this on me, ni lenarai, for not wanting to prolong your healing, and I cannot prevent you from doing so, how I swear I will chain you to this bed and paddle your ass red, I said through gritted teeth as my other half went insane because her scent had vanished.